The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Canada, the United States, and Mexico are bound together by geography and trade. But amid narco-terrorism and mass migration flows, a growing populism has critics fearing that Mexican democracy is backsliding. Tonight, why and what to do about it. Then, as cities across Ontario deal with all manner of, some say wildlife, others say vermin, we'll look for solutions to keep them in check. It's Thursday, May 18th, and that's coming up on the agenda. By law, the current and highly popular Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, cannot run for another term in next year's general election, and he's vowed not to try. Still, moves such as the changes to election law made recently by his government, but stymied by the courts, have critics worried that he is positioning his party to revive a kind of one-party rule that threatens Mexican democracy. Let's get into that, shall we? With, in Mexico City, Lorena Becerra, political analyst and the head of public opinion research for one of Mexico's leading newspapers, Reforma. In Washington, D.C., David Frum, staff writer at The Atlantic Magazine, and in Ithaca, New York, Gustavo Flores Macias, professor of government and public policy at Cornell University and the former director of public affairs with Mexico's Consumer Protection Agency. And it's great of the three of you to join us on TVO here tonight. Before we talk about Mexico's democratic future, we do have to talk about the border because it's been such a huge issue for so long. Lorena, I want to start with you. You're a pollster. You know, we all know that Americans living close to that border with the United States and Mexico are distressed at the state of affairs. Donald Trump, of course, made great hay about that issue, turning it into a big winner for his presidential campaign. What about Mexicans, though? Is the border an issue for them?
Well, basically, hi, it's a pleasure to be with all of you. Basically, the border is mostly a problem for people living on the border. So we do have to think about Mexico in different segments of the population. The north has developed a lot more economically, specifically in certain terms. The center of the country is positioned differently, and the south has been the one that has lagged behind economically more. So we expect right now, what we see in surveys is that the people in the north are the most distressed with what's happening in the border. They associate immigration to a lot of crime, a lot of insecurity, and a lot of government inefficiency. So this is an issue that President López Obrador is going to have to deal with. Okay.
Gustavo, I'm told that as of 2018, half of illegal residents in the United States are Mexican citizens. Half. Talk to us about the economic significance of Mexicans, both legal and illegal, living in the United States and their significance to the Mexican economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again for having me. There's quite a bit of significance economically. Mexicans that come to the U.S. Often play a really important role sending remittances back to Mexico. And the amount of remittances and the importance for the Mexican economy has increased, gradually but steadily over time. This is during the pandemic, for example, there was a big concern because all of the remittances were interrupted and there was a real dip. But they've come back roaring. And back in Mexico, for families, for households, they really make a difference. Now, in terms of the economic impact of Mexicans working in the U.S., for the U.S., on the U.S. side, I mean, we see that the U.S. population is experiencing this slowdown in terms of the growth of sort of the native born. And there's this real sense that increasingly the U.S. requires just labor at all levels, right? Sort of qualified and perhaps low skilled as well. And Mexican migrants fulfill that role across the board. It has been an important aspect in keeping the economy going in the U.S. And, inflation is a big concern right now in the U.S. Cheap labor certainly has helped keep inflation down. And it's something that, people are now reacting to. But Mexican migrants in the U.S. play such a crucial role in keeping prices down.
Very good. Now, with that background in place, we're going to turn our attention to the issue at hand, the increasingly controversial president of Mexico. And David Frum, I'll bring you in on this. I read your, well, in my view, superb piece in The Atlantic. This really sums up in an excellent fashion all of the troubles that the country is having right now. But let me set up my question to you by just reading an excerpt from your piece in The Atlantic from a couple of months ago. Mexico's erratic and authoritarian president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is scheming to end the country's quarter-century commitment to multi-party liberal democracy. He is subverting the institutions that have upheld Mexico's democratic achievement, above all, the country's admired and independent election system. On López Obrador's present trajectory, the Mexican federal elections, scheduled for the summer of 2024, may be less than free and far from fair. If López Obrador succeeds in manipulating the next elections in his party's favor, he will do more damage to the legitimacy of the Mexican government and open even more space for criminal cartels to assert their power. Okay, David, let's understand this, because he can't run for re-election next year. So what damage do you fear that he can do?
Well, let me just begin by asserting my own personal stake in this. Unlike your other guests, I don't have a personal connection to life in Mexico, but I was present at the beginning of the transition to multi-party democracy. In the elections of 2000 in Mexico, for the power transitioned from a president of one party to a president of another party by means of a free and fair, peaceful election, something that had never before happened in the nearly 200-year history of the Mexican state. That miraculous, breathtaking event was honored by a visit to the White House by the incoming president, Vicente Fox, in the fall of 2001. And I remember seeing him on the south lawn of the White House. I was working there at the time, and being in a big crowd of well-wishers and excited people. And this was part of the global democratic transformation that we so admired in those days. But this one was especially intimate because it was so close at hand. And Mexico is a country that has so many opportunities, but has had such struggles. In the year 2000 and 2001, it really seemed like a page had been turned, and Mexico was going to on its way to catch up to the developed world. If the Mexican economy had grown from the time Mexico entered NAFTA in the middle 1990s until now, at even a quarter the speed of the Chinese economy over those years, Mexico would now be looking very like a country in Southern Europe, that level of development. And that's the heartbreaking thing. What are we afraid of now in Mexico? When you talk about the subversion of democracy, it may conjure up the idea of some kind of authoritarian dictatorship. That's not really the thing to worry about the most. The thing to worry about the most is that in his attempt to snuff out democratic institutions, the current president, López Obrador, is going to weaken even further the already weak Mexican state and lose power to criminal organizations. Mexico has always suffered from a weak state, a state that can't make its authority run, that can't protect people, that can't collect taxes. Democracy is a huge asset for a state. It gives the state legitimacy. It answers the question, well, why should I pay your taxes? Well, you voted for it. That's why you should pay the taxes. If López Obrador continues to do unto Mexico what he's been doing, you could see not a return to the kind of heavy-handed authoritarianism of the past, but to a breakdown of authority that opens the way to all kinds of criminal elements who already are so present in so many areas of Mexico's territory.
But Lorena, just a quick follow-up. Nobody's concerned that he's going to change the law and allow himself to run for another term. Are people concerned about that?
He is not seeking re-election. What he has done, as David has said, he's been dismantling a lot of counterweight powers. The autonomous institutions that used to regulate the energy sector, the telecom sector. López Obrador is a president who does not like limits. He does not like external limits. He does not like oversight. He does not tolerate criticism. And even from the press, like he has been systematically attacking the press. Since he controlled Congress for the first half of his term, then he was very happy with the way he was passing laws. He lost the constitutional majority after the midterm elections, and this put him in a different mindset. So what he has tried to do right now is completely dismantle the National Electoral Institute, which was the safeguard of our democracy. This institution was approved by the majority of the population. It has run elections freely and fairly. It has supervised elections. These elections are conducted by the citizens, and it has even managed to succeed in conducting elections in states that have been plagued by organized crime, like Tamaulipas. So it has been a very successful element of democracy.
But Lorena, let me jump in on that for a second, because I know that you're a pollster, so you will appreciate this. Morning Consult, which is an organization that did polling around the world, they polled 22 countries. He's the third most popular leader in the world, behind only Modi of India and Berset of Switzerland. I mean, he's over 60%. Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau would give their eye teeth for those kinds of numbers. What makes him so popular?
But in Mexico, we have to look at our history. In Mexico, most presidents are popular. Since 2000, which is what we consider a democratic period, since Vicente Fox, even since 1994 with Cedillo, where we had our first divided government, etc., most presidents have been around high 50s, low 60s. The only exception was Enrique Peña Nieto, the president who was former to López Obrador. So in Mexico, we have to put those numbers in context. That does not mean that he has a blank check to do whatever he wants. And that's why we have seen a lot of opposition. We saw him have a very important electoral defeat in 2021, not only in the congressional elections, but in specific cities and in Mexico City and in the state of Mexico. So we have to put that in perspective. For advanced democracies, for industrial democracies, these are high numbers. In Mexico, and generally, presidents are well liked. We are very lenient with our presidents, and we don't have re-election. So, that doesn't necessarily turn into electoral numbers. Ernesto Cedillo, who had high approval ratings, had to turn over power to Vicente Fox, which was from a different party, and Felipe Calderón had to do the same. He turned over to the PRI. So we have to put that in context.
Understood. Gustavo, can he say that he has improved the lives of the average Mexican citizen?
Well, it really depends on which dimension we're talking about. David mentioned earlier some of the challenges that Mexico faces, and I think he's correct in pointing these out. But it's also worth, as Lorena mentioned, taking a longer view. And many of these challenges have been around much before López Obrador, right? Some of them, the issue of crime or immigration or the trade relationship with the U.S. These are challenges that are ongoing, and some of them become more or less salient depending on the presidential period. I think it's safe to say that there are important sectors of the population that truly believe that there has been an improvement in the way things are going. And then, I think it's important to look at the numbers, right? I focus mostly on the issue of crime and government responses to crime. That's what my research is about. And, there's a real sense that this increasing trend that was taking place in Mexico in terms of violent crime has at least reached some form of inflation point and has stopped increasing as much, has stabilized. I think if you ask most people would still say that's not quite enough. López Obrador, the current president, promised a real change in terms of violent crime and how it was affecting Mexicans. But many people point to that and say, look, it's not as bad as it used to be. There's also an important perception when it comes to corruption. And, corruption perceptions are important. I don't think corruption is any different today than it was 6 years ago, 12 years ago, 18 years ago in Mexico. It has been such an important challenge for Mexico. But the perception is important. And I think this is changing the way people see their relationship with government. So for vast sectors of the population, and this is why López Obrador is so popular, they truly think that government is working for them in ways that the government didn't before. Again, this may be a matter of perception, but it's something that explains why the opposition has had such a difficult time putting forth real alternatives to this project.
Well, David, let me follow up with you on the crime angle in this, because you referred to it, or at least I guess I referred to it at the end of that excerpt of your piece in The Atlantic that I just read. In what ways do you see Obrador creating more space for criminal cartels in today's Mexico?
Well, let's give a sense of how extreme the crime problem is in Mexico. So in the United States, which Canadians think it was a very violent society, about 330 million people and about 20,000 homicides a year. 20,000 in a country of 330 million. Mexico's got a population about a third that of the United States, and it had 35,000 homicides, half again as many. Okay, well, that's pretty shocking, but here's what's even more shocking. Out of every 100 homicides in Mexico, about 5 end up with some kind of resolution, some kind of charge being brought, some kind of process, some kind of resolution. 95 out of 100 homicides, nothing happens. The homicide leads to no result. When you talk about López Obrador and what he's done for ordinary people, one of the things that people in Canada will know about López Obrador, this is the way he's always described in our press, the left-leaning president of Mexico. So when you hear that, that makes you think, well, he must be some kind of social democrat or socialist. He must be trying to bulk up the social insurance state, paying more. None of that is true. Actually, what López Obrador has done is to squeeze what there is of a Mexican social insurance system. And what he has done instead, and this is part of the secret of his popularity. Look, if you're in a developed country, your entitlement to the benefits of the state exists whatever your attitude to the government. Whether you like the prime minister or the president or the king or whatever, if you're a citizen of Canada or the United States or Norway or any other country, your rights and entitlements are exactly the same as a critic. No special advantage. What López Obrador has tried to do is dismantle all the parts of the state that are impersonal, everything that is social insurance, and build instead a new form of income supplement that is personal, that depends on your attitude toward him. This is how it was in the bad old days. If you supported him, you got a pension. If you didn't, you didn't. If you supported him, you got some kind of, and your child was sick, you had access to a hospital. If not, not. Now, the old Mexican social insurance system was inadequate. Mexico could easily have afforded more. Mexico is not a desperately poor country. It's middle income by global standards. And many countries that are poorer than Mexico do a much better job of general social provision than Mexico has done. But Mexico's problem has always been that authority is too personal and the state is too weak. And López Obrador is making the state more weak and making the authority more personal. But he's not building some kind of big social welfare system. That doesn't interest him at all.
Gustavo, we should talk about the drug trade. And here's a headline from the Mexico Daily News from a few days ago. The headline is, "As fentanyl deaths rise, Mexico and the U.S. lack cooperation." Question, do you think Mexico could be doing more to stop fentanyl from crossing the American border?
Certainly. I think the Mexican government relies quite a bit on this notion that, there are all these external forces that are to blame for what's happening in the country. And it often points the finger at the United States and sort of the consumption issue, certainly, and also the flow of guns and weapons that cartels use into Mexico. But there's plenty of blame to go around within the Mexican system. David was pointing to how few cases actually reach court, and impunity in Mexico reigns supreme. I think that's one of the main challenges in this country, that drug cartels always take advantage of this. There's very little accountability for politicians and public officials who help out cartels, who are in bed with criminal organizations. And that's a major challenge. So the Mexican government can certainly do more, in terms of regulating substances, the importing of substances from China, from other parts of the world. It can certainly do more in terms of addressing the public safety issue from a civilian perspective, strengthening civilian institutions and the judicial system, as opposed to sort of this militarized approach that in part has been encouraged by the United States, not only in Mexico, but in Latin America and other parts of the world, that seems to be this easy and very popular solution to organized crime. But the reality is that there's plenty of evidence that militarized approaches do very little to improve public safety. So a real commitment to strengthening institutions that are civilian in nature and the judicial sides of things to address impunity would certainly go a long way.
Lorena, I hate to put it this crudely, but is a drug-addicted United States of America good for the Mexican economy?
It would be hard for me to speak to that. What I can say is the public perspective on the current strategy to combat organized crime is that it has failed. Actually, it's one of the worst numbers of President Lopez Obrador's presidency in general. When we talk about economy, when we talk about job creation, when we talk about social programs, which are very important, as David was saying, the worst part of his presidency has to do with how he has handled organized crime. And he has had this policy that he says hugs, not gunshots. Most of the population disapprove of this policy. And one of the reasons that it's not costing him right now electorally, or it's not costing him in approval ratings, has to do with the fact that no former president was able to succeed in this area. So in general, what we see in the population is that there seems to be sort of a loss of hope on what can happen. And what they're looking into is more regional approaches. They're starting to look at their governors, at their mayors, to try to solve this type of problem.
Let me do one more round on this drug issue, and I guess we'll start here with this tweet from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs that came out a few days ago. It says, the U.S. has itself to blame for its domestic drug abuse. China supports Mexico in defending independence and sovereignty and opposing foreign interference. We're ready to work with Mexico and the rest of the world to counter cross-border drug crime. And David, maybe I'll bring you in on this. This was in response to Louisiana Senator John Kennedy's suggestion that the United States ought to send troops over the border into Mexico to deal with the drug cartels. Do you know if there's anybody at the highest levels of the American government taking that suggestion seriously?
Not at the present government, no. Although it's become a glib talking point among some Republican politicians. But I want to register protest against a phrase you used. You called them drug cartels. For the criminal cartels in Mexico, drugs are a very important line of business, but not the only one, and maybe not anymore even the most important one. They also smuggle people. They also steal natural resources. They also siphon off oil and electricity. And increasingly what they do, and this is the most worrying thing they do, is I don't think there's another word for it, they tax. In much of Mexico, in many, many parts of Mexico, they are the government. They collect protection money that functions as taxes. What security there is, they provide. If there's a dispute, you don't go to a court. The courts are useless. You'll never hear from the courts. They adjudicate in a corrupt way, but they adjudicate disputes. They are a kind of quasi-government. And to give you a sense of how powerful they are relative to the existing government, on the 6th of January of this year, the Mexican military arrested one of the sons of the famous criminal El Chapo. He was traveling in a convoy of, I think, 24 armed vehicles. And don't just think SUVs. These are flatbed trucks with 50-millimeter cannon on them. Army helicopter gunships attacked the convoy, and they did arrest him. But they started a gun battle that left, for every 2 of the criminals who were killed, a soldier died. I think it was 11 soldiers to 20 criminals. And after the arrest, the criminals went on a rampage through the capital of the state of Sinaloa and attacked the airport and fired bullets that penetrated civilian airliners. So the Mexican state remains the single strongest actor in the boundary of Mexico. But it's not like these cartels are almost alternative governments, and drugs are just one of their lines of business. So the question, and this is why things like that comment you quote are so goofy, what Mexico needs above all is state building. It needs to have a proper government. Mexico is an OECD country, part of that club of wealthy nations, that the world's 30, 40 wealthiest nations. On average, it taxes about half as much as an OECD country does. It doesn't have an effective military. It doesn't have an honest court system. It doesn't have an effective army. And so things that the state fails to provide the basics for people, and then criminals step in and act like alternative governments. Trafficking drugs, yes, but a lot of other things too.
You mentioned the military, and I want to pick up with Gustavo on that, because the president is broadening the military's mission, not just defending Mexico from enemies, but also they are economic players in the country. They build and manage the airport, for example, in Mexico City. What does it say about the place? What does all of that say, Gustavo, about the place of the Mexican military in the economy and the affairs of the country?
The Mexican military has really played a crucial role in this administration for not just domestic law enforcement, which is certainly very problematic, but also, as you pointed out, it has become involved in, some spheres that really the military should have very little to do. And now it's running port administrations, port authorities, it's running infrastructure projects, major airports, It's running even tourist, sites and resorts. It is really permeating so many aspects of Mexican society. And this is really problematic. In Latin America, there's a long history of militaries coming into power through military coups, through violence. And what this government is doing is really opening the door entirely to an institution that is very opaque in the way that it operates. There's very little oversight, and one that enjoys quite a bit of trust coming from the Mexican population. So the military is now at the center of government decisions, even questions of science and technology and which scholarships are assigned. The military has a seat at the table. So in most democratic societies, at least in liberal democracies, this would be considered excessive. And it does not bode well in the sense that whenever a government decides that the military has gone too far, even short of a military coup, how is that civilian government going to roll back this presence? How is this civilian government going to check the role of the military and try to establish a balance in civil-military relations? So this is extremely problematic for Mexico. And unfortunately, the trend continues to be one of increasing roles and resources rather than the other way around.
All right, Lorena, let's look forward. We've already mentioned the fact that the president cannot run to succeed himself. So in about 14 months' time, there are going to be elections. And could you give us a sense about what the options are for the Mexican people when that national election happens next July?
So right now we have an option from Morena, the president's party, clearly. I think that the strongest option is the mayor of Mexico City, Claudia Sheinbaum, and I think that's the president's choice. We also have an alliance between the PAN, the PRI, and the PRD, which is like an ideologically all over the place alliance. But they have performed, I think, successfully or satisfactorily in the last local elections. And we may have an alternative option, which is a social democratic option, which is called Movimiento Ciudadano, that has some important figures. And we have to see whether they form an entire, like a broad opposition alliance. I think what we have to think about are the scenarios of what the next presidency is going to look like. One option is a president from Morena, with like a strong president with a majority in Congress. I think that is not the most likely option. I think it's very likely that the next president is not going to have the 53% that López Obrador had in 2018. Another option is a president of Morena with a divided government. I think that is a very likely option. The next option is an opposition president with a Morena Congress. I think that's maybe less likely, but it is an option that's out there. And the rest of the options, like an opposition president with a strong government, with a strong Congress, are very, very unlikely. So I think that's what we're looking at. The thing is that the 2024 election is one of the largest that our country will ever see, because we have Congress, we have 9 governor races, and we have a lot of municipal elections. And the fact that people are looking at their local leaders really has a lot at play, because we see split tickets, we see the local arena affecting the federal arena. So I think it may turn into a very interesting election.
Gustavo, I do need to ask you about the Morena candidate that the president hopes will succeed him, Claudia Sheinbaum. Mexico's never had a female president. They've never had a Jewish president. What do the people think about that possibility?
Well, I think it depends who you ask. It's interesting the way you put it, that she seems to be perhaps the president's preferred candidate. And even that is very contested, right? I think there are at least a couple of others that people point to as being also within maybe the top 3 candidates that the president would have in mind. Another important one is the current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marcelo Ebrard, who has been part of the president's project for quite some time now, and something would also have a strong chance at becoming president. It really will depend on what the primary results will show. That it looks like there will be some polling mechanism, some survey mechanism in order to determine who will be the next person. But if it happens to be the mayor of Mexico City, certainly some people point to, these first, the first female president, the first perhaps president of a Jewish president or different backgrounds than most of the presidents we've had. I think it would be something that the Morena, I'm going to call it the machinery, the electoral machinery of Morena, of the party, the clientelism, these things play such an important role in Mexico that whoever wins the primary, whether it's Sheinbaum or Ebrard or someone else, I think will have a pretty strong chance of becoming president. And that certainly, people will have to decide. But I think it'll be a really interesting race at the very least. Certainly the primary, and then to see whether the opposition is able to mount a compelling project, which there aren't a ton of signs of that at this point, unfortunately.
Okay, with just a couple of minutes left here, David, I want you to take us into Washington, D.C. You know how that town works. We know they're quite focused when it comes to Mexico on the refugee issue at the border, but are they focused enough on some of the democratic deficit issues that you have expressed so well in your Atlantic piece? What do you think?
Can I pick up on those last two questions? This is, I think, a thing where Canadians really need to be focused most as partners with Mexico and NAFTA and as effective neighbors. What is López Obrador's end game? The cultural taboo against staying more than 6 years is strong, and I don't think he will break it. His plan is to find ways to extend his power beyond his 6 years. That's been done before in Mexico City. López Obrador is a close student of Mexican history. There was a president in the 1920s who left office on time and then continued to run Mexico behind the scenes through his control of party machinery, the army, and the economy. That's López Obrador's plan. Why does he? It's so breathtaking. Mexico is going to have the first female Jewish president. That's so inspiring. That makes her weak. That's why he wants her. The army is being put into all these things that invite corruption, where the army is going to control customs and be taking bribes and be deprofessionalized. That's not a mistake. That's what he wants, because his vision is he will leave office in 2024. And then, like his predecessor of a century ago, he hopes to control the army because he will know every dirty secret in the army, because he's introduced the dirty secrets in the army. He'll have a successor who will be beholden to him. He's also introduced a provision where she's subject to recall at the halfway through her presidency. And he controls the party that will do the recalling. And she will be someone who's very different from the way Mexican presidents have traditionally been in the past. And those are other things that make her weak and subject to his control. So his plan is to keep power while giving up office. It's been done before, not in 100 years, but that is going to be the new Mexico. And the price of this attempt to exercise power in this way that will not seem legitimate to Mexicans is the continuing retreat of this weak state and the continuing opening up of spaces for these organized crime quasi-governments that do trade drugs but do other things too, to start exerting power all through the state. And this is going to be an enormous security problem for the United States and for Canada, and one that North Americans beyond Mexico's border and the many Mexicans who live outside, one out of every 8 living Mexicans lives in the United States. Well, these are things that the whole community of the continent needs to take seriously.
As I said earlier, if people want more on this, they really should check out David Frum's piece in The Atlantic from the February edition. And I want to thank the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and explaining this story to our viewers and listeners so well. Lorena Becerra, the political analyst, the head of public opinion research for one of Mexico's leading newspapers, Reforma. David Frum on the other end of the spectrum there, at least geographically, as I look at my television set right now, the staff writer for The Atlantic in Washington, D.C., Gustavo Flores Macias, professor of government and public policy, Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Muchas gracias, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe there's a new litter of raccoons in your garage, or a scratching noise in the ceiling that makes you think squirrels. How about an all-consuming confrontation with a skunk? In cities and towns across Ontario, people and wild animals interact whether they want to or not. New York opted to hire a rat czar to oversee their biggest problem. Does something similar make sense for the critters we see in our cities here? Let's ask Natalie Carvonen, director of the Toronto Wildlife Centre, and Brad Gates, owner and president of Gates Wildlife Control. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Now, to get us started, let's get a sense of a typical day at the office for both of you. This is actually a video of Brad Gates on the job with his colleague and some uninvited attic dwellers. Let's have a look.
Thank you for being quiet. Thanks for being quiet, buddy. You're a good boy.
All right, so I can guarantee that the control room was doing a bunch of ahs because that was very cute.
Yeah.
What's important to take note in that video is that you are reuniting the babies with the mother. What you probably didn't see there was the mother was on the other side of the fence.
Yes.
Tell us about your methods. We want to make clear that your business is wildlife control, not extermination. Your company's slogan is the animal's choice
Correct.
since 1984. So tell us a little bit about the distinction.
Correct. So when I started my business in '84, the most common way of removing wildlife was to set a live trap, catch it, and take it many miles away and release it. And I knew there had to be a better way. So what we started to do is finding methods to keep the family unit together, keep them in an area that they're familiar with, where they can find their food and find additional shelter. And we, over the years, we haven't perfected it because we're always learning on how to do things better, but I think we're well on our way to using the animal's biology and behavior to help them get their babies back, relocate their young, and continue to live in an area that they're familiar with.
All right. Full disclosure, Natalie, I was chatting with you off camera that I spent the summer volunteering at the Toronto Wildlife Centre, working with the Squirrel Nursery, where a lot of volunteers got their first start. But for our audience, tell us sort of the work that the Toronto Wildlife Centre does, and how is it different from what Brad does?
Well, we are the busiest wildlife center in the country, so it would take quite a long time to explain all the things that we do. But I guess to the point of this program, we have a wildlife hospital, which is very busy. We admit about 6,000 wild animals a year that are sick, injured, or orphaned. With regards to the orphans, I mean, we've known Brad's company for a long time because we do consider their work to be very responsible and humane. And there's very little licensing for wildlife removal companies out there. So a lot of really crappy companies are generating a lot of work for us. So each year we get requests to take so many babies that are, I guess, orphaned in the sense, I use quotation marks because they probably still have a mother, but their mother has probably been trapped and taken away and dumped somewhere now. And all those babies are left behind. And sometimes it's even homeowners who don't know any better and they have a trap, they don't realize it's a female with babies. They say, oh, there's a lovely forest on the way to my cottage. They drop her off, she's probably not gonna live. And then a few days later, they're screaming babies and they have to call us. So we're dealing with, in addition to the orphans, sick and injured wild animals, and about 300 different species. There's a huge diversity of wildlife in the Toronto area.
Give me a range of what type of animals you're dealing with.
Many, many species of owls, many species of hawks, many species of bats, an amazingly huge diversity of songbirds. There's deer, beavers, mink, weasels, rabbits, opossums, just a lot of waterfowl like swans and grebes and loons, just a huge diversity of wildlife.
All here in the city. Yeah.
All in the city, yeah. I mean, this city has an amazing amount of green space and a lot of natural areas, which is something that I think many of us really love about Toronto and surrounding areas. And we put a lot of resources into that, but it causes a lot of problems because it means that wild animals are living in very close proximity to things that are not only a danger to them, but can be a frustration to people as well.
All right. We're not going to talk extensively about rats or mice, but I do want to talk about this just because, as we said off the top, New York just appointed a rat czar to help bring down the population of rats. Does Toronto or Ontario's urban centers need something like that for rats and mice? Do we have a problem like New York does?
Not like New York. I think New York is probably one of the filthiest cities in North America, and that is why they have such a problem. There's so much access to food and shelter that their numbers just explode. I think Toronto is on its way to doing a pretty good job at controlling some of the mice and rats in our inner city. And they've done that by, just recently on April 1st, they introduced the no feeding wildlife bylaw, which is great because you're not introducing wildlife to people. And so we are different. We should keep our distance from one another. Also, the city has bylaws on property standards, where we have to keep our backyards and our properties in decent repair so that animals aren't attracted and wanting to break in. And just the green bin in itself keeps the food waste that we produce away from these critters so that they're not again, multiplying quickly.
All right, we'll get back to that bylaw because I definitely have some questions there. So, Natalie, it's good. It doesn't seem like we have a rat problem, at least to the extent, if we compare it to New York. But I'm curious, what creature is Toronto's #1 wildlife challenge?
Well, it depends on which direction you're approaching it from and who you ask. I think, I mean, some people might say raccoons, you know, because they get into garbages or roofs or things like that. Some people might, if they're in parks, they might say Canada geese because they poop a lot along the shoreline. That's often when people are feeding them, though. Right. Some people might say coyotes, you know, if they're worried about their cat who shouldn't be outside free roaming. That's a whole other issue. Or their small dog. So I think it depends a little bit on who you ask.
I'm going to stick with the raccoons because I think a lot of work has been done to sort of get raccoons out of our garbage and such. What is the best way to deal with them? And I'm assuming a raccoon czar is not needed in terms of that. But I think when people think of urban centers in Ontario, particularly Toronto, we see raccoon. That's sort of the image that a lot of people see. What is the best way to sort of, and I don't want to say deal with them because, hey, we're in their backyard just as much as they are in our backyard. So
we need a human czar. So in my opinion, it really comes down to human behavior. We have a very, very busy wildlife hotline at Toronto Wildlife Centre. Actually, I think it's the busiest one in North America. We get a crazy number of phone calls about all manner of wildlife issues. I took a call once years ago, which is indicative of the problem. It was a woman who had spent the last 3 months teaching her local raccoon, who she had named Bandit or Rocky or whatever it was at the time, to open her kitchen door, come into her kitchen, and take food from her mouth. And she thought this was a great achievement. And her neighbors were horrified. You know, this raccoon knows how to actually open the screen doors to their houses. But so many people feed raccoons, and so many people feed other wild animals. People put food out for their pets, who, again, shouldn't be outdoors unsupervised, but the raccoons get into that. And I agree with Brad that green bins are a great step forward. But if you go places like the Danforth, every restaurant and variety store has an overflowing dumpster behind it with all kinds of food scraps, and the raccoons are like, woo, and there's 20 raccoons every night feeding from there. So I think first and foremost, we have to look at human behavior. I always talk about my cottage, which is in a very remote area, and the only time we see raccoons is on our trail camera, which is the motion-activated camera, because we don't feed them. There's a provincial park there, and they're normal raccoons. But in the city, we effectively train them to behave badly.
What do you say, normal raccoon? What does that actually mean? I think, like, for people who live in the urban center, a normal raccoon is one that's crawling on our green bin and you know, sort of walking the sidewalks and sort of scaring people, or you know, I had a run-in with a raccoon not that long ago. I was like, oh, but a normal one is what? Scavenging on its own on a trail.
A normal wild animal should not be anywhere near people. A normal wild animal should be afraid of people, should be not see people as a food source, shouldn't see, you know, Brad and say, hey, you might give me a sandwich. I'm going to go up to this guy and see what happens. So if they're left to their own devices in a truly wild setting, they would just be going about their business, eating berries and turning over logs and looking for earthworms and fishing for crayfish along the water. And if they saw a person, I do see a raccoon up there maybe once every 5 years, and then they go, they run into the forest. That's what a normal raccoon or any other normal wild animal should do.
All right. So, Brad, as Natalie was saying, some people welcome these animals into their homes openly. Sometimes they get in different ways. Now, we do have some items here. Tell us what we are looking at. We'll bring this up on the camera.
So this is a vent that exists on every home in Toronto. And roofers have gone away from the metal vents that were more formidable to keep animals out of the attic, but they could still get into the metal ones, but not nearly to the numbers that we're seeing the plastic vent.
And this would be on the roof, right?
This is on the roof. It allows the hot air in the attic to escape during the summer months so the moisture doesn't build up. And you can see here that a squirrel has easily, and probably in less than 2 minutes, chewed the face of this vent off. And then once inside underneath the cover, they can get into the attic itself. But raccoons simply peel this lid completely off, and then they have this nice square opening that leads directly into the attic space. And this is where they go to feel protected, raise their family, and just stay warm during the winter months.
All right, let's talk solution. Very easy, because this is what you
Yes.
have. Tell us.
Exactly. So anytime we do a wildlife removal from a home, we highly recommend that homeowners put these cages on top of the vent. That way the animals cannot get to the vent and manipulate it, and therefore then cannot get into the attic.
At the end of the day, it starts really with this, because you were saying this used to be made differently.
Yes, it was made of metal, much harder for an animal to chew on or even manipulate. But the plastic roofers have done a service to us in the sense that we are now doing more work because of them using plastic roof vents.
All right, very good. Natalie, I want to come to you. As Brad had mentioned, on April 1st, the City of Toronto passed the bylaw to make it illegal to feed urban wildlife. Songbirds, of course, are exempt from that. Why is this important?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned before, like one of the animals that someone might call a challenge is a coyote. But even talking about raccoons, as we have been, if you feed wild animals, then a couple of things can happen. First of all, you can change their behaviors because they now see people as good. They see people as someone to go to for food. And people don't like coyotes running up to them or their kids, wondering if they've got a handout for those animals. I don't think coyotes are something really to be afraid of. They're a 30-pound animal. If I have to handle one, I drop a tea towel over their head and just hold their mouth shut. It's not a grizzly bear, but they still do evoke this feeling of the big bad wolf, and people are nervous, if a coyote will just walk right up to somebody. And similarly with raccoons or squirrels, other animals will also lose their fear of people, like pigeons or geese. People don't tend to be afraid of them, but they more complain about the poop. So those things are all not great things. But for some animals, like pigeons and raccoons, if you feed them enough, you actually increase their numbers, because the amount of animals in an area will be dictated by food, water, and shelter in the area. And if they have abundant food, then instead of having 4 babies that year, maybe they'll have 5 babies or even 6 babies, because there's just a plethora of food and they can actually have more babies. So in urban areas, raccoons are actually at a higher density than out in Algonquin Park or something like that, because it's a great place for them to live. There's lots of food.
I want to talk a little bit on the education side of feeding, because I think some people, and you've talked about this, we know where you stand on cats, outdoor cats, and I understand why. There are people, and I don't want to put my best friend on blast, but cat colonies. These are, lots of people think they're doing a lot of help, putting out food for cats and thinking that, this poor little animal doesn't have food. I need to feed it. I need to, one said friend has it on a timer and has all this stuff ready to go, but also attracts all of these other animals like possums, skunks, and raccoons. How do you balance that education where people think that they're doing good, but ultimately it is this reoccurring problem?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to talking through sort of the fundamentals and the biology of what's happening with the people. As I mentioned, you talking about the fact that you're changing behaviors and elevating populations. I mean, generally, in all the years we've been doing this, I've never met a mean person who feeds wildlife, or who feeds feral cats. It's all coming from a good place. So it's just trying to talk to those people and get them to understand that they may actually be doing a disservice to the animal. So if it's a wild animal that they want to feed, if they desperately want to feed them, then we will say, if it's songbirds, plant berry bushes, in your area, or natural food sources for those animals. The feral cat colonies, to me, they're not wildlife, they're domestic animals, but that's a really, really complicated issue that would probably require a whole show in itself. I'm a huge cat lover myself. I worry about feral cats being just left out there. The feral cats themselves are subject to so many diseases and being hit by cars. I remember seeing one in the annex, the Bloor Annex, when I used to live there, that had dangling broken back leg, and you couldn't get near him. He was just running away from you with his dangling, sure, incredibly painful, broken legs. So it's a hard life for them out there. But then they, in turn, have an enormous impact on songbird and small mammal populations. So it's a complicated issue.
Very complicated. Brad, apart from denying food sources to wildlife, what else should city slickers be doing to prevent damage not only to themselves, their homes, or their pets?
Well, wildlife populations grow or expand depending on the amount of food and shelter that's available, as Natalie mentioned. So if you can control the food aspect, the next thing to control would be shelter. Now, there are a lot of older buildings in Toronto, and I don't think you could button up every house so that an animal will not get in. What most animals look for is an opening about 1 inch by 1 inch, and if they can get their nose into that space, they can expand, chewing on the wood or tearing with their claws. They can expand that opening big enough for them to get their body in. So homeowners, if they're looking not to ever have a wildlife problem, they should install the screens we just showed on their roof vents. They should cap their chimneys and have the house regularly inspected to make sure there aren't any openings or that a storm hasn't taken shingles off that eventually could cause an animal to be interested in moving in.
Because correct me if I'm right here, about 60% of your calls have to do with sort of the roof.
Correct.
Okay, that's a big number. Is it ever a good idea, I think I know the answer that you're going to give me here, is it ever a good idea to poison urban wildlife?
Never. And it's been the primary means of controlling rats and mice. You can almost see it on the outside of every commercial building in Toronto, these black boxes that have poison inside them. And Natalie knows this all too well because animals show up at her shelter all the time that have been secondarily poisoned. So, and it can even affect the domestic.
What do we mean by secondarily
So
poisoned?
when a rat or mouse gets poisoned, it's a slow death, it's a terrible death for them, and they often will wander outside. So now you have this animal that has succumbed to poison, might be barely alive or maybe already dead, but even a cat or a dog that may be at the house in question goes outside and eats this, they can then get the poison into their system. But we probably see it more with wildlife species where a raccoon or even bird of prey,
Possums,
all kinds of animals will eat readily available dead or dying animals. And so, yeah, poison should not be used to
What
control.
is then, say, with mice and rats, what is the best way?
I guess the alternative to that would be a snap trap type of a trap that causes instant death. But yeah, that's basically the only really alternative to poison is to use one of those.
All right.
But fundamentally, if you don't change the food, water, and shelter available for mice and rats either, then you will always have lots of mice and rats in that area. So really,
100%.
it's like, as Brad's been saying too, it's looking at food, it's looking at shelter. Why are there so many mice and rats in that area? And trying to identify the fundamental problem and deal with that. Otherwise, you're just doing cruel things to animals who feel pain just like your dog or cat does in perpetuity and not really solving the problem.
Exactly.
Natalie, I'm going to come to both of you for this one, but Natalie, start with you. How can urbanites subscribe to the philosophy that, let's all get along, living alongside and with wildlife, when some people will say that, some of these are quite dangerous in terms of, raccoons can harbor disease, skunks can harm our pets with their spray. You talked about coyotes and sort of people thinking that their small dogs are for dinner. So how do you balance that conversation and get people to buy into the philosophy, Natalie?
Yeah, well, raccoons harbor no diseases that people can get. The only possible one for discussion might be rabies, but almost all of our raccoons in Southern Ontario are vaccinated against rabies now through a program that Ministry of Natural Resources has been running. So
how about the one distemper? Is that something
people don't get distemper. Raccoons got it from dogs. We do a lot of disservices to wildlife, but people cannot get distemper. So, I mean, I think I feel like some people feel a little bit entitled nowadays that they just don't want to be inconvenienced by anything, which is a bit of a broader statement. But I think that most people, though, when you talk to them about the fact that, we all love living in cities that have an abundance of nature and beautiful green spaces, you love to go for a walk in the ravine, that kind of thing, then we can't pick and choose the wild animals who live in those areas. So if an animal bothers you or you're afraid of an animal, then we just encourage people to learn about that animal. I I've been working with wildlife my whole life, and I am not afraid of any wild animal. I will walk happily in a ravine system here. There is no wild animal that I'm concerned about. You know, maybe if I encountered a short-tailed shrew and I had to grab him with my hands. It's our only venomous, little mammal that we've got here. But I think when people actually take the time to learn about them, it usually brings that whole stress and fear right down. I can't tell you the amount of calls we get on our hotline about snakes, for example. And we have a lot of people in the Toronto area who come from countries that have dangerous snakes. We don't have dangerous snakes in Southern Ontario. If you go further north, there's one snake that is poisonous, but it's a species at risk, and you're very unlikely to encounter it. So we get calls about people who are hiding behind their couch and they've got the windows boarded up because they've seen a garter snake, and all we really need to do is spend 5 minutes talking to them about the fact that it's a completely harmless animal, and they feel better about it.
Brad.
Education is key. I totally agree with everything Natalie said. Part of our job in removing wildlife is the homeowners that call us are sleep deprived. They're afraid that the animal's going to drop through the ceiling and attack their family. So we need to convey to them that that's not reality. And how we do that, often we get the call, they don't care what we do to the animals as long as they can get back to sleep and they no longer hear this noise in the house. When we go up in the attic and we remove the babies that you saw in the video and we go down into the house, we take a moment to show them the babies. And they do a complete 180 in their thinking that they wanted the animals killed. The next words out of their mouth are, "You're not going to hurt them, are you?" So one customer at a time, we're educating them that wildlife are not dangerous and we should learn to coexist. And through screening the roof fence and protecting their house, they can have a long-term solution and not experience a wildlife problem ever again.
We're going to have to leave it there. Natalie, Brad, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From Thunder Bay to Hamilton and points east to west and in between, our Ontario hubs cover the province. You can find the latest stories from our hubs journalists and videos with a wider perspective anytime at tvo.org/OntarioHubs. That is the agenda for Thursday, May 18th, 2023. Canada promised to plant 2 billion trees by the end of 2030 as part of this country's fight against climate change. Tomorrow, Nam Kiwanuka checks in on progress towards that goal. I am Jan Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and Nam will see you tomorrow.